is change. It may change for the better, it may change for the worse. It may go into a new concept or go back to an old one, but it will change. Now, we are changing, trying to constantly. I'm going to attempt to tell you some of the changes that I anticipate. I've also been asked a number of times, what sort of results are you going to prove by thus and such research? Well, in a sense, that's a stupid question. If I knew what kind of results I was going to produce, then I wouldn't have to do the research. If you know in advance the results of research, then it isn't research, and it's a demonstration. Now, sometimes that's necessary also. A very large part of the research done in this country, or rather published in this country, was in fact never performed. I could quote you chapter and verse and names and dates of a long list of very highly respected individuals in the field of physiology who have published papers on research programs that in fact never happened. They sat down at a desk one day and took a pencil and they wrote down the figures that they would have produced if they had done the study, and they published it. Now, since you might say, well, you might be able to prove what somebody did, but how do you prove what somebody didn't do? Well, one of these studies, the man does not mention either the date, which is perhaps the single most important part of any research, the date. Oh, you invented the wheel. Well, that's nice. When? It means nothing if you're second or third or 19th. When did you invent the wheel? And where did you publish that revelation? Well, now, if there were wheels being used prior to that or talked about, then you didn't invent it. So the date is perhaps the single most important thing in any research study. This man didn't bother to mention the date. I wonder why. The second most important thing is perhaps the where. He doesn't mention that either. Well, a little third-grade grammar school arithmetic, if you read the study and look at it, will tell you, since he claims that he personally supervised the whole study in detail, that this man has either a very fast watch or a very slow one, because it would take him 200 hours a week. The number of subjects he had, the number of exercises they did, the number of sets, the number of repetitions, the rest between the studies, the pace of movement, and so on. Well, it's very simple. You sit down and you add this up, taking his own data. It would require 200 hours a week, and he personally did it all. Well, I don't have 200 hours in my week. I don't think he does either. In due course, we're going to give him a chance to produce the research subjects in court. Supposedly, he had 20 of them. He may get one guy to get up on the witness stand and perjure himself and claim he was one of the subjects, but when we get through with the first one, the other 19 will no longer be in the courtroom. They will have suddenly remembered imperative business elsewhere. We're going to put the first one in the penitentiary for perjury, if there is a first one. A great deal of such research goes on. It isn't research, it's fraud. Another study was done on behalf of Ken Cooper in Texas, the aerobics guru. That's given him the benefit of the doubt. To compare the effectiveness, the value of fast training versus slow training. Well, now, what is your definition of fast? What is your definition of slow? Well, I'm going to give you a demonstration here, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me whether this is a fast movement or a slow movement. No catch. Now, is that fast or slow? That's obviously slow. That's 150 degrees per second. Let's prove that. 1,001, 1,002, 1,003. So it might be 145 degrees or 152 degrees. That's approximately 150 degrees per second. And that's slow. Well, what were his parameters? His parameters were fast was 90 degrees per second, or 60% of my slow movement. And slow was 60 degrees per second, or 40% of my fast movement. He wasn't comparing fast to slow. He was comparing very slow to extremely slow. But he labeled them fast and slow. So all the idiots out there, dumb enough to believe this, look at it and say, oh, yes. Because what does the average person see when you tell him 90 degrees per second? They can no more relate to that than they can fly by flapping their ears. So what do? They relate to the only thing they've ever seen with 90 on it, and that's the speedometer on their car. Oh, yes, 90 miles an hour, that's fast, right? Yes, therefore 90 degrees per second is fast. Do I exaggerate? No, I'm understating. And besides, they've been told it's fast. Now, they compared these two groups. They were going to settle this scientifically, once and for all, stop all this foolishness, this argument. And then they announced that they're equal, that fast and slow, no difference. And yet, from their own data, their slow group, their 60 degrees per second, produced 54 units of improvement. Their fast group, 37 units of improvement. Now, since when are 54 and 37 equal? The next time I'm in Dallas, I'm going to write a check for $37,000 and give it to Ken Cooper and tell him to give me my $54,000 cash, since they're the same. Anybody want to bet on whether he'll do it? Now, that's the kind of research that's been done, is being done, and largely will be done in this country. It's criminal. Literally. A lot of it isn't even done, isn't performed. It's lied about, faked. Or if they do it in such a sloppy fashion that when they get through, anybody who makes any sort of conclusions based on this data ought to have his head examined. People say, why do you do your own research? That's why. Next month, in cooperation with the School of Medicine at the University of Florida, we're going to start a 10-year study on osteoporosis using post-menopausal women. Women past menopause, whether this is naturally resultant from age or if they've had a hysterectomy. Osteoporosis is demineralization of the bones. If you live long enough, it affects everybody. You lose height. It affects women more than men for two reasons. One of them, after they go through menopause, they suffer a gross hormone change. Secondly, they don't do as much heavy work as men, generally. For both those reasons, they start losing the minerals out of their bones. How does it affect a woman? Well, in a number of ways. They get shorter. They develop what's called the dowager hump, a bump on the back of the neck and shoulders like a buffalo, which can become very extreme. The back starts bending, the hips start breaking, and by the way, 75% of those people that have a broken hip from that cause don't live over it. They die within the next few weeks. A large part of osteoporosis can be prevented by one factor, exercise. In some cases, it can be rehabilitated. But in almost all cases, it can be prevented. This much is known. Now it becomes a matter of shoving it down the medical community's throat as to how much exercise, what kind of exercise, how often, how long, how hard. One of the problems has been that until very recently there was no effective method for diagnosing osteoporosis or demineralization of the bones. The only tool, short of autopsy, and most people are prejudiced against that in their own case at least, the only tool was X-ray, which is very poor. There's some diversion of opinion in the medical community. Some doctors will tell you you have to have lost half of your bone before it even shows up on X-ray, 50%. Some say 30%. The general consensus is about 40%. So in other words, you've lost 40% of your bone, you have suffered irreparable damage, and probably lost several inches of height before osteoporosis can even be diagnosed, by which time it's too late. Recently, they have come up with some very sophisticated machinery which can diagnose osteoporosis within 1%. There are, as far as I know, only 2 such machines in the world. We just bought one of them. It will be installed next month at the University of Florida School of Medicine. We're going to start a study that'll run 10 years. We will have published results every 6 months. And we're going to compare groups of women, older women, some of whom have diagnosable osteoporosis, some of whom show the signs but could not be diagnosed earlier, some of whom have no visible signs. And we're going to take control groups, and we're going to do this in a very, very careful manner. Our people, Nautilus people, will conduct the study. We will do the training. But outside people will do the testing. And the results will be certified by the University of Florida School of Medicine. The interest in this is enormous. The value of it is potentially great. We know that exercise will help. We know it'll help to a tremendous degree. It's important to the people. Economically, it's important also. Because as this data is provided and certified and widely publicized, not by us, it'll be publicized by the media, by the networks, by the women's magazines, by Newsweek, Time, and other people, because this is important medical information. Now, what is the commercial potential for this? Enormous. No matter how you categorize people, if you break them into groups, well, the first such break is by sex. You have more women in this country than you do men. And while this study will be valuable to men, it's of more immediate value to women. So you've got a very large segment of the population. If you break people up, you take the women now as a category and break them up into age groups. Arbitrarily 25, 0 to 25. They couldn't care less. They don't have these problems yet. They're never going to have these problems, or so they believe. Okay, so you're not going to get those. 25 to 50, you're going to get about half of them. 50 on, you're going to get them all. Now, what does that represent in numbers? It represents in numbers the single largest group of women in this country, 50 and over, plus about half of those between 25 and 50. So we're talking here about perhaps 60 million women who are very interested. Economically, older women, on the average, across the board, have more money. And secondly, psychologically, they're more worried about their appearance. They're more worried about medical problems. They will be more in tune to making use of something of demonstrable value that's been clearly pointed out to them. So people operating training facilities, this information will be supplied to you as it becomes available. And eventually, this one market, prevention or rehabilitation of osteoporosis in women, could be several times as big as the entire currently existing health club market in the United States. And it probably will be. That's one thing we're working on. Recently, we have introduced several new machines. It's my personal belief that the low back machine, which was designed not only for osteoporosis but also for anybody, is probably realistically the most important machine for anybody, for a man, a woman, or a child, because most people sooner or later, with or without osteoporosis, most people sooner or later have low back problems. There has previously never been a good method of training the low back. You do deadlifts with a barbell in the position of contraction. There is no force on those muscles, but there is compression force on the spine. If you've seen the low back machine, it maintains the resistance throughout the movement, and there is zero compression force on the spine, none. I personally feel that's the most important machine we've ever developed. Insofar as overall growth is concerned, the new squat machine is beyond any slightest shadow of a doubt the most important machine we've ever developed. We have been trying for 14 years to build a squat machine. Until 3 months ago, I didn't know how. No one else knows how even yet. Why? What's the problem with a squat machine? Your strength varies enormously in the performance of a squat. When you start out in a low squat, in a low position, way down, you are medium strong. As you start to come up, you get considerably weaker. You have a sticking point. But as you pass that sticking point, and particularly as you near the end of the squat, your strength increases enormously. At the very end of the squat, as far as your muscles are concerned, you are infinitely strong. Your muscles could withstand the universe if your bones could stand it. And by the way, we've now figured out how to build a machine with infinite resistance, but we haven't found anybody dumb enough to try it. It would not only self-destruct itself, but whoever was in it. Several of these developments have come about more or less simultaneously. I tried for 14 years to build a squat machine. We did build one back in the early 70s. And we built another one, which we used in the research programs at West Point and other places, in 1975. The first one we built was in 73. It was a better machine than a barbell squat, better than a leg press machine, but it was nowhere near as efficient as I wanted it to be, and I didn't know how to make it more efficient, so we never marketed the machine. We built one prototype, and we still have it. We could have sold them. We could have been selling them from 1975. We could have sold thousands of them, but we never would. People wanted us to, because I didn't know how to build a squat machine. But we kept trying. And about 3 months ago, I ran into a bit of information, accidentally, which suddenly opened my eyes to something I'd been looking at for years and not seeing. And now I know how to build a squat machine. If you've tried it, it may feel a little too heavy to you near the end of the movement as you lock out. It isn't too heavy. That's simply because you have not been training that part of the movement properly in the past, so you are disproportionately weak there. But you use that machine for 4 or 5 weeks, and it'll feel smooth as silk to you, because for the first time in your life, you will be developing that part of the muscle. What's the significance of that? Well, there are several points that are important. One of them is the portions of the thigh muscles that are most important for stabilizing the knee do not become functional until the leg is almost straight. Now, you can, to a degree, work these with a leg extension machine, but to work all those muscles properly, you need a machine that will bring all of those muscles into play against maximal resistance, right slam up to the lockout. And that machine will do this, but nothing else before ever would. Then, as a result of trying to improve that machine, I discovered something of even greater importance. Something that's never been published, will be in the near future. Something we will call iso exercise. Iso is a Latin word. It simply means same. Now, in a sense, we've been building iso exercises, single axis iso exercises, since day one. If I get in a curling machine and do a curl, and you get in it and do a curl, and he gets in it and does a curl, we will all three experience precisely the same resistance, assuming we plugged in the same amount of weight. If the cam is right, it'll be right for anybody, a midget or a giant. If the cam is wrong, it'll be wrong for anybody. If it's nearly right, it'll be equally nearly right for anybody. Everybody will experience precisely the same thing, right or wrong, in that machine. But that's a single axis machine. Until about 8 weeks ago, I was convinced that it was impossible to build an iso exercise during a compound movement. But now we know how to do it. I noticed a relationship that I had overlooked previously. Like most discoveries, we came across this one accidentally. We built the first squat machine, and it had 2 adjustments. The seat had to adjust horizontally, and the shoulder pads had to adjust. I didn't like that, because it's difficult enough to get people to adjust one thing. If they got to adjust 2 things, that makes it too difficult. So they get in the machine however it happens to be, and if it's not crammed up so close that it won't function at all, well, then they use it. Which means that man A uses this part of the cam, and man B uses that part of the cam, and nobody does it right. So that wasn't acceptable. I somehow wanted to get away from having to adjust the shoulder pads. In that machine out there, that's not an iso machine. It's a duo machine, a Duo-Squat. In attempting to solve the problem of adjusting the shoulder pads, and by the way, I've never solved it, and I now realize I can never solve it. So the iso machine will have to have adjustable shoulder pads and an adjustable seat. More important, the seat must not only go back and forth, it must go up and down. Because the relationship that I had overlooked before, you see, a single axis exercise has a relationship between your elbow, for example, and the machine. They're coaxially mounted. They're rotating on the same axis. And if they are, as they should be, then the machine is the same for everybody. But with a compound exercise, a bench press, a leg press, a squat, some people's legs are longer than others. So they will move the lever of the machine a greater distance, or if they're shorter, they'll move it a shorter distance. There was a similar relationship, elbow axis to machine axis, but I had overlooked it. That relationship is between the human's hip axis and the machine axis. And if you design the machine properly for an individual, any individual, a giant or a midget or anybody in between, and then if you design the seat so that as you move the seat to make individual adjustments, you maintain that hip axis on that line then that machine is the same for anybody. What's the advantage? It'll be more efficient. And secondly, it then becomes a meaningful tool for testing purposes. If I have him do a squat and have him do a squat, doesn't tell me anything. If he can squat with X pounds today and later with twice X, then he has increased his strength. But the fact that he can squat with X and he can squat with 2X doesn't mean he's stronger. It may simply mean his legs are shorter. But if I put him in that ISO squat machine and test him, whoever lifts the most weight is the strongest man in direct proportion. So it becomes a very significant tool for comparison of people. As it is now with most exercises, it's meaningless to compare one person to another person. You can compare yourself today to yourself next week or yourself last month. But with most exercises, trying to compare man A to man B doesn't tell you a thing. But with the ISO exercises, you will be able to make such comparisons. So it will have a very valuable place, not only more efficient exercise, it'll have a very valuable place in medical testing, in rehabilitation, and another number of other areas right now that are the purest guesswork. Will that machine be justified? It will unavoidably be larger, more complex, and more expensive. We've never built one yet. We know how. And there are two different ways to build it. In either case, they're big, somewhat complex, and unavoidably expensive. Will they be practical in a training center? Some people will want them, but generally this will be a medical machine for diagnosis, for accurate comparisons. That machine will be more efficient than our squat machine, the Duo-Squat that we have here today. But the Duo-Squat is a much more practical tool in training large numbers of people. It doesn't provide ISO exercise. It will change slightly from man A to man B. And it's not a good tool for comparing man A to man B. But it's an enormous improvement over any other leg exercise that ever existed previously. That's another thing that's come to light recently. Thirdly, we are doing, in cooperation with an MD, and he is doing, and we're cooperating, a study with pregnant women to see what effect proper strength training will have, if any, and it appears to have a very significant effect on delivery, push time, rehabilitation following delivery, and other factors. Now, we have already had several hundred subjects go through the training program, and including their delivery. It appears that there is a very meaningful reduction in push time. That is to say that the actual birth is easier and quicker. It appears there is a gross reduction in the need for cesarean sections. This is all preliminary. We will publish nothing in the way of data on this until we've done 1,000 subjects clear through delivery and post-delivery rehabilitation. This study also will continue. And we have several other projects underway. So that basically is the future as I can see it at this point. About 30 years ago in one of the muscle magazines, I don't remember the name of the author now, although I'd recognize it if somebody knows it, I read something very brief. I understood it, but I ignored it. But I remember it well now, and I also know that I should not have ignored it. This was written at a time when the marathon workouts were first coming into vogue. And after a year or two of the long workouts, this man said, or words to this effect, He said, perhaps we should, instead of trying to determine how much exercise we can tolerate, perhaps we should be trying to determine how little exercise we actually require. Well, that was a brilliant comment. I read it, remembered it, but didn't act on it. There is today still the old problem of people attempting to equate quantity with quality. If a little bit's good, then more is better. And in some cases, perhaps that's true, but it is not true in exercise. People ask me, well, what's the right amount of exercise? I don't know. But in general, the more I reduce it, the better results I get. Ideally, in that case, you'd get infinite results if you just quit. Well, of course, at some point, it becomes counterproductive. What I'm about to tell you, however, is a little contrary to that. Personally, I am beginning to suspect that best results for lower body exercises, particularly for the buttocks and the thighs, come from one set of very high repetitions, perhaps as many as 100 or more. It is a very painful way to train, and not a very pleasant way to train, but all indications that I have at this point indicate that it's a very productive way to train, if you can stand it, if you can tolerate it. And surprisingly, if you're doing an exercise like the squat, it does not require much of a reduction in resistance. If you can do one repetition with 400 pounds, then you can probably do 100 reps with 380. So a slight reduction in maximum weight will permit you to do an enormous number of repetitions. Why the difference? I don't really know. This is speculation. But I do know that the muscles of the legs are different from those of the upper body. The muscles of the legs are inefficient compared to those of your upper body. Your thighs have their size primarily because they're inefficient. At any given moment, you can only use a small percentage of the total number of muscle fibers. Then what purpose do the extra fibers serve? That's where you get your endurance. If you could utilize every fiber in your thighs, and you did so simultaneously, you would produce unimaginable forces. You'd be so strong you wouldn't believe it. You'd also be a cripple, because not only would the muscles tear themselves loose, but you'd crush the bones longitudinally. I don't mean bend them and break them, you just compact them. If every fiber in your legs fired simultaneously, you wouldn't have any legs left. That's not possible. But assuming it was possible, and assuming you could stand those forces, yes, you'd be very strong once, and then you would be infinitely weak because you would have exhausted every fiber simultaneously. They would then all have to stop and rest. You'd have nothing in reserve. So your legs are given a large percentage of extra fibers so that you can do the necessary work while using only a small part of them. When those fibers get tired, other fibers come in to replace them. And in this fashion, you can continue a relatively high level of work for a long period of time. If you put a man in a curling machine, for example, hook it up to a computer and put a scale in front of him and tell him to produce statically the highest reading on there he can get, and then maintain it for 1 minute. So maybe he gets a reading of 100. 1 minute later, he may have only 8 or 10. He has literally, his strength has declined 80, 90, 95% in 1 minute. Now, it won't feel like it to him. He'll be pulling as hard as he can. He may be reading 8% at the end of that minute, but that 8% will feel like the 100 did at the start. Put the same man on a leg press machine, and if he produces 100 at the end of a minute, he'll probably still be producing 100, or very close to it, in the high 90s. Your upper body, the muscles are built for short, heavy work, not for endurance. Your legs are built for endurance. These are facts. Is that why the higher repetitions are more productive for the lower body? I suspect that that's probably the case. I can't justify it. That's just conjecture. But we do know that the muscles of the lower body are different, and in what manner they're different. So I don't recommend that you try to do this with the average person in a health club. They're not going to do it. It's too painful. Secondly, it takes too long. But for your personal application, if you want to produce the best possible results, on a squat or a leg press, I would take just a little bit less weight, not much, 5-10% less than you've been using, and increase the repetitions enormously. Work up until you're doing 50 with each leg, or 100 total, and then increase the weight. And I think you'll be surprised at the results you get. Again, only one set. We are stepping up our research into other areas that I'd rather not comment on at the moment. The computer machines, this is a computerized curling machine, after 8 years are still in development, but they're getting close. We have functional machines now. We are at this point with the computer machines. Now it's a matter of making them inexpensively, attractively, we got the function, and reliably. We cannot put out a machine that's going to fail in the field. It's got to be completely modular so that when a component fails, a light will come on saying, tilt, I have failed. And then an arrow will come on pointing like this, and it will say on the arrow, remove black box number 1. And then a flashing light will come on, and it'll say, I am black box number 1. Pull me. And as you pull it out, it'll say, throw me in the trash can. And then it will say, reach underneath and take a new black box number 1 and insert it in the machine. There will be 3 prongs. Those prongs will be thicker than your finger. Why? So some idiot won't bend them or break them. How big do they need to be? As thick as a hair. But they'll be as thick as your finger. Why 3? So you can't put them in upside down. And they will not be an equilateral triangle. And you can put it in sideways. It will only go in one way. And if you beat on it with a sledgehammer, you won't bend it or break it. The plug that goes to the wall connection will be as big as your wrist. Why? So 4 people, when they get a hold of the machine and decide to move it to the other end of the gym without unplugging it, won't tear the guts out of it. Instead, when they come to the end of the connector, they'll find it's impossible to move it. Then it might occur to them to go unplug it. But in the meantime, they'll either tear the wall out. All of these things have got to be designed into it. And I'm not joking. You're laughing. I'm serious. Because otherwise, oh, it's broke. It doesn't work. A nut came off and lays there in plain sight. And the next time they get around to sweeping the place out, they'll sweep the nut out. The machine is broke. People today are not mechanically inclined. So you've got to make it foolproof, which means literally proof against the misuse of fools. And when you get into things of this sort, there are a lot of things to go wrong. So you've got to make it modular. Those are the areas we're working on now, but they're coming. I hope it won't be another 8 years before they're here. How much time we got left there, Thomas? What? Any questions? It's hard for me to see you back there in the back. Speak up. I'm hard of hearing and you're a long ways.
Research on pregnant women. I'd like to speak to them in a little bit more detail.
With the people in pregnant women?
Yes. Who's doing the research on which of your staff? Can I speak to in detail about it?
Well, we will have there are 2 doctors, a PhD and an MD, that are actually in charge of the pre and post testing and in charge of the study, but we will, some of our people, including an MD on our staff here, will actually conduct the training, the one-on-one supervised training. So if you'll catch me in the hall when we get out, when we get through here, I can talk to you about it a little bit more. Any other questions back there? Yeah. I'm looking right into the lights. I can hardly see you.
The new type of leg training you were talking about, doing the 50 to 100 reps, how many days a week would you suggest doing that? Still 3 days a week?
I honestly don't know. That remains to be seen. But certainly no more than 3, and perhaps only twice.
And what would be done on the 3rd day? A small amount of exercise?
Well, if you find that twice a week is enough, then you probably wouldn't do anything for the legs on the 3rd day. Any other questions?
The essential function of the new computerized machines, is it simply going to act as an idiot box to tell you when you're using it correctly, using correct force, or is it going to have some other function?
All right, in practice, here's what will happen. You will take a man up to, for example, that machine. He's never seen it before. You will sit down in the machine, thereby showing him what he's supposed to do. You will put your elbows on the pads in line with the axis of rotation of the machine, explaining to him as you do it what you're doing. You will take a hold of the 2 handles, one in each hand, and then you will point to the readout section, and you will then demonstrate what you want him to do. You will explain to him for him to put his elbows there, take a hold of the handles, and line the handles up so they're in line with one another. Each arm will then be in the mid-range of possible movement. Then, slowly, statically, produce force against those handles without permitting either one to move until you're inputting the maximum possible static force. Having done that, you will then slowly relax, and I emphasize slowly relax. It is more dangerous I don't know why, but it is. I know it is. It's more dangerous, more likely to produce an injury if you suddenly release a force than it is if you suddenly apply one. So you should not ever move suddenly against a force. Don't apply it quickly. Don't release it suddenly. Apply it slowly and then gradually release it. Having done that, then extend the right arm, simultaneously flexing the left, and then extend the left arm, simultaneously flexing the right. Now you put your man in the machine, and he does, step by step, he does the same thing. You now know everything you need to know about that man. You know his strength in that position. You know his possible range of movement. And from his strength in this position, you know what his strength should be in every position. The machine will take note of this, and the next time that individual comes in, it will provide him with an appropriate level of resistance for his existing strength level. He will then train in the machine, following, more or less as a pilot follows a flight director. He will have a light arrangement which will tell him how fast to move, the range of movement, the number of repetitions, and the force that he is inputting. If he is putting in the proper amount of force, he'll get a flat light, a line of lights. If he puts in too much, it'll go above that. If he doesn't put in enough, it'll go below. So he will be told by the machine what to do, precisely. and a record will be made of what he has done. And all of the machines will work in the same fashion. Now, you might, for example, ask him to do, his strength might be, these figures are arbitrary, he might produce 100 pounds of force statically. Fine. Now you want to give him 50% of that. That's arbitrary. So you have plugged him in on a 50% program. Now you're going to ask him to do 10 repetitions, again arbitrary, at 50%. Well, the first repetition will be quite easy. You're only asking him to do half of what he can do. So that's very easy. The second repetition will also be easy, but not quite as easy. By the time he gets to about 9 repetitions, he will be doing his absolute maximum and failing. His force indication will have dropped down to maybe 40%. The lights will be telling him that he's not putting in enough. And of course, the computer will record that on the 9th repetition, he was no longer able to do 50. That's his point of failure. Subsequently, the next workout, he will again be asked to do the same amount by the machine. If during that workout he is able to do 10 repetitions, if that's the guide number, with the ask for 50%, then the machine will take note of that. The following workout, when he comes back, it will increase his resistance. It'll still be 50% of his one-time maximum, but it'll be a higher force level by about 4%. Well, then with a higher weight, he won't be able to do as many. He'll get maybe 8 repetitions with that. And gradually, he'll work up to where he can get 10. And when the first time he's able to do 10, the machine will automatically increase it. And this will not only keep a record of what you've done, but it'll give you a printout showing precisely what you've done in every position. If your range of movement increases, you'll know that. If you increase your flexibility. If you lose flexibility, you'll know that. You will know how your strength is going up in every position. So workout by workout, you will have a precise record of your progress. Any other questions?
Recently I've read that sports like tennis, bicycling, racquetball have peaked out of their interest curve. Where do you see the interest curve for high intensity weight training being at this point in time?
Well, our business has continued to grow. We are not growing this year as rapidly as we did last year or the year before, but we're still up. I think it'll continue to grow. I can't read the future any more than you can. I don't like a lot of things on the economic horizon, but I believe that weight training, strength training, health clubs, and similar applications will continue to grow if we don't have a total collapse. If we have a total collapse, we're all in the street with shotguns, so it doesn't matter. But assuming anything less than a total collapse, I think the thing will grow. I think it'll slow down for a while and then start back up again. I'm not particularly surprised by tennis, racquetball, handball peaking out. That is a very active activity, one that's very easy to get into and one very easy to lose enthusiasm for. Most people, within my experience, in my opinion, just don't have the stick-to-itiveness in a program of that sort. Properly applied weight training, in some senses, is easier. And you get progressive, seeable, measurable results. You get immediate feedback. From tennis, from racquetball, you don't have that sort of meaningful feedback. So I'm not at all surprised that tennis and racquetball and handball have more or less peaked out. I anticipated that. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, what about your new book that's coming out about novels for bodybuilders?
I'm sorry?
Your new book is coming out?
My new book? I don't know anything about it. That's Al Darden's book. You'll have to ask him. Don't hold me responsible. What?
I think we talked about that yesterday. It'll be out in about 2 weeks.
I'll know about it when I read it. Don't tell me you're associating with bodybuilders now, Al. Any other questions? Well, I guess that pretty well covers it. So, in general, we're working on research in a number of areas, and as we get the information, it'll become known to you. But several of these things will be very significant. All right, thank you.
Langer, and I'm pleased to have in the studio Mr. Arthur Jones. Arthur Jones is president of Nautilus Sports Medical Industries and creator of the Nautilus equipment. Welcome to the Medicine Man, Arthur.
Glad to be here, Steve.
We hear terms and we see terms in the media, isometric exercise, isokinetic exercise. They seem to be used interchangeably. My question to you is, what is isokinetic? What is isometric exercise, and are they the same?
No, they're not the same. Both the terms, isometric and isokinetic, like all terms, are invented phrases or names intended to give a certain impression. Iso is a Latin term which simply means same. Metric refers to the length. In this instance, the length of the muscle. So isometric exercise implies, or is intended to imply, an exercise in a static position, an exercise in which movement does not occur, where you are straining immovably against an unmovable object. So the name comes from the fact, isometric, same length, that the length of the muscle remains constant during the exercise. Back in the 50s, a great deal was stated in favor of isometric exercise, particularly by a group of people in Germany. The credibility of the particular people was such that the claims initially made for isometric exercise were accepted at face value. But a few years went by, people in this country experimented with isometric exercise and were not capable of producing benefits comparable to the claims made by the people in Germany. Eventually, somebody went back and questioned the people who originally came up with isometric exercise and said, "We have not been able to duplicate your results." The Germans redid their research, came back with a bit of egg on their face, and admitted that, well, neither can we. We overstated the benefits of isometric exercise. So isometric simply means pushing against an immovable object, exercise without movement. More recently, the term isokinetic. Now again, iso is Latin. It simply means same. In this instance, the second part of the word, kinetic, comes from kinetic energy. That means movement or speed of movement, the implication being constant velocity. In other words, movement with a constant speed of movement. In fact, then, isometric and isokinetic have very little in common, except they're both modalities or methodologies of exercise. Isometric is still, stationary, non-moving. Isokinetic is, in theory, movement at a constant speed. Well, to begin with, great claims were made for isometrics. Subsequently, it was proven that they could not live up to these claims. More recently, even more fantastic claims have been made for isokinetic exercise. Nor can these people live up to their claims. If I were going to design a poor methodology of exercise, then I think my first choice would be isokinetics.
We'll be right back with Mr. Arthur Jones. Welcome back. We're talking with my guest, Mr. Arthur Jones, creator of the Nautilus equipment, and our topic is isokinetic exercise.
I commented earlier, Steve, that if I were looking for a poor, a non-productive, or for that matter, a dangerous form of exercise, in essence, a very bad form of exercise, that I probably would quit looking if I stumbled onto isokinetics. So in spite of all the claims made for an isokinetic exercise, none of which claims can be proven, in fact, none of which claims can be supported, isokinetics is a very poor way to train, for the very simple reason that isokinetic exercise eliminates the negative or eccentric part of work. The scientific community seems to prefer the terminology concentric and eccentric. I don't like the terms for two reasons. They're too close. Concentric, eccentric in speech or in writing are too close. They're too similar. They lead to confusion. People have to stop and think. They get the opposite impression. Therefore, they frequently get the opposite impression. Therefore, I prefer the terms negative and positive.
Arthur, I've seen articles in various medical media and various exercise media saying negative exercise is worthless exercise, and the only thing that's of value is positive exercise.
You have seen those articles written by people who are in the employ of companies that are producing an isokinetic brand of exercise. What would you expect them to say? If you go to Ford, do you expect them to praise Chevrolet? If you go to General Motors, do you expect them to praise Ford or Lincoln or Mercury? These people are doing research. They're being paid. They are employees of a particular company. So they're going to praise the house. They're going to maintain that what their product or their methodology is better. But making claims, Steve, is one thing. Being able to back up those claims is something else. Let's look at the simple logic of it. In the first place, let's define our terms.
Please.
If you lift an object, if you curl a barbell, if you lift a rock, your muscles are contracting. They're becoming shorter. That is positive or concentric work. Having gotten it to the top, if you now lower it back down, that is eccentric or negative work. Now, the nature of isokinetic exercise devices is such that they have eliminated the negative part of the work. Their resistance in one form or another is based on friction. And friction, by its very nature, has no back pressure of negative work. They don't have negative work in their exercise. Therefore, it's evil. I'm reminded of the first so-called improvement in the shape of the square wheel. They went from a square wheel to a triangular wheel. And then they tried to rationalize this as an improvement in the shape of the wheel on the basis that it provided one less bump per revolution, only 3 bumps instead of 4. Well, of course, there's only one meaningful shape for a wheel, and that's perfectly round, which means an infinite number of sides, and therefore no bumps. But here you have an idiot who doesn't understand the wheel. He starts with a square wheel, and he's going to improve it, so he goes to a triangular wheel. Then he tries to rationalize this because he's got one less bump per revolution. Well, somewhat along the same lines, the people that are marketing, that are promoting, that are touting isokinetic forms of exercise are trying to rationalize the removal of the most important part of exercise. If you remove the negative work from exercise, there is no stretching because there is no back pressure of negative work to provide stretching. As a consequence, there will be no benefit whatsoever to your flexibility.
It sounds to me, though, from just your definition of negative work, that negative, like using the curl as an example, letting the barbell down, and work is a contradiction in terms.
No, it's not a contradiction in terms. If you raise a barbell and then simply let it drop, then you're doing no work. But if you lower it down under control, you have to perform work in order to do that.
I see.
Part of the confusion results from the fact that they try to take physical definitions of work as applied to a machine and apply that to a human being. For example, the definition of work and the definition of power as normally applied to a machine are not applicable to a human being. What if you stand with a barbell in your hands at the mid-range of possible movement with your forearms parallel to the floor, supporting that weight? There is no movement, either up or down, therefore no work is being performed. Now, since power, by definition, is the rate of work, well, if you're performing zero work, then there's zero power. So you're neither performing work nor are you producing power. Well, now, if that's true, why can't you stand there and hold it forever? Why does your face turn red? Why does your blood pressure elevate? Why do your muscles become tired? Why do you perspire? Why does your metabolic rate increase? And why can't you stand there forever? Since, according to the definition of work and according to the general definition of the accepted definition of power as applied to a machine, you are neither working nor are you producing power. Well, then you're doing nothing. Well, metabolically you are working, because in order to support that weight, you are producing force. Therefore, your muscles are working, regardless of the fact that they are not moving. Therefore, if you raise a weight or if you lower a weight, metabolically you are working. Your muscles are producing force.
I had something happen to me last summer. I was at Yosemite Park climbing one of these steep mountains, and I had no trouble at all going up to the top. But I found, and I didn't realize, and it probably has bearing on the essay that I read that you wrote about negative work, coming down the mountain, when I walked down, my legs went into spasm, the muscles went into spasm. I could not...
Because you're working. In 1936, my brother and I visited the centennial of, no, I'm sorry, that was 1933 in Chicago. In 1936, we visited the Texas Centennial in Dallas. And we walked down from the top of the tallest building, which I think was about 39 stories. The next day, we were cripplingly sore. 30 or 40 years later, I realized that had we walked up, we would have been tireder, but we would not have become as sore. That's one of the differences in negative and positive work.
But I had already walked up, but coming down, I just couldn't do it. I had to stop.
Did you get sore?
Very sore, and muscle spasm, the whole business.
That was a result of the negative work.
We'll be right back with my guest, Mr. Arthur Jones, creator of the Nautilus equipment. We're talking with Arthur Jones, creator of the Nautilus equipment. Arthur, can we expect to get sore every time we do negative work? Two-part question. And number two, is getting sore necessarily bad?
Getting sore is unpleasant. And it seems to be well established that the negative part of work will initially, now note that word initially, cause more muscular soreness than an equal amount or an equal magnitude of positive work. But muscular soreness does not recur in an individual that is training on a regular basis. For example, if I take you into a gymnasium and you've never trained in your life, and I put you through a normal workout with barbells, for example, both lifting and lowering, doing positive and negative work, then you can expect to become, if you work hard the first time. Now, mind you, this is the first time you ever trained in your life. You can expect to become very sore. Let's call that magnitude of soreness a 50 on a scale of 0 to 100. So the next day you will have maybe a level of soreness of 30. 2 days later you'll have a level of soreness of 40. 3 days later you'll have a level of soreness of 50. So you will become somewhat sore 24 hours after your first workout. Markedly sore 48 hours afterwards. Markedly sorer than that another 24 hours later. And then, having reached a peak of 50, it will start to decline. 3 or 4 days later, it'll be back to 0, assuming you continue to train. Now, that's the pattern with normal work, which is both negative and positive. If instead you had done a negative-only workout, then instead of being sore at a level of 30 24 hours later, you might have been sore at a level of 50 24 hours later, which is the peak that you reached previously after 72 hours. So you have gone higher faster. Then 48 hours after the first workout, 2 days later, you might reach a peak of 60 or 65.
Can we assume from what
But while the soreness will be greater and while it will come quicker, it will decline more rapidly. So that instead of staying sore for a week, you will probably be entirely over the soreness in about 4 days, assuming again that you continue to train. Then you can forget the soreness. It will never come back as long as you continue to train on a somewhat regular basis. So being sore from an exercise is normally a one-time phenomena. It can be avoided. It's not necessary to become sore at all. If you go into the gym on the occasion of your first workout and do a medium workout, that will produce little or no soreness. If you go back on the second workout and do a little bit more, that will produce little or nothing in the way of soreness. And if you spend 2 weeks gradually working into the program, then you will never experience muscular soreness. But if you just jump in hard and heavy the first time, then you will become sore. But it's not something that repeats itself. You're not going to continue to get sore every time you work out. No matter what you did after the first 3 or 4 weeks of steady training, you will not produce any degree of muscular soreness. It does not come back.
Is it possible to do a negative-only workout in a gymnasium?
Well, you can do a certain limited number of exercises. For example, we had we did an experiment at the military academy at West Point in 1975. The Bengals, a professional football team from Cincinnati, had hired a football player. They'd signed him up to a contract. They'd given him an $80,000 bonus. The man weighed 286 pounds, and one of his tests in order to be accepted was he had to chin himself a certain number of times. You know, do a pull-up on a bar. This man couldn't begin to chin himself. 12 days prior to his reporting for the training camp, they sent him to us in desperation and said, make this man capable of chinning himself. Otherwise, we're going to blow our $80,000. We've given him the $80,000. He spent it. It's gone. If he can't chin himself, we're going to have to drop him. So do something, please. You got 12 days to do it. Well, you know, we take him to a chinning bar. He reaches up. He grabs a hold of the bar. He tries to pull, and nothing happens. So what do? Well, you can't train him in a positive manner. He's incapable of pulling himself up. So we put him on a bench in the top position. And then we removed the bench and told him to lower himself. The first time we did it, he went zap to the floor. He just about yanked his arms out by the roots. He couldn't even do a negative chin. He couldn't lower himself. So we held him up. We stood under him, held him by the buttocks, and gave him assistance so that he could do part of the negative work. 12 days later, he was tested. He did 4 3/4 chins in a normal fashion, pulling himself up and lowering himself down, pulling himself back up. He didn't quite get 5, but that was more than enough to pass his test. Those kind of results can be produced with negative exercise. They cannot be produced in any other fashion. The negative part of work, Steve, is by far the most productive and the most important part of exercise. And when you leave the negative work out of exercise, you have little or nothing of benefit left.
We'll be right back with Arthur Jones after these messages. Welcome back. Our guest is Arthur Jones. Arthur, how can a person who is interested in incorporating more negative work into their training program go about doing it?
There are a certain number of exercises that you can do in a negative fashion without help. Unfortunately, doing pure negative work is not practical for all exercises. You can do chins, for example, by climbing up stand on a chair to get into the top position and then lower yourself down. Most women can't chin themselves, but most women can do a negative chin by simply climbing up onto a chair or a footstool into the top position, then taking their feet off of the stool or the chair and slowly lowering themselves down. By training in that fashion, within a few weeks they will increase their strength so much that they can do chins in a normal fashion. And a few other exercises like that. But where possible, don't try to avoid the negative part of work. In fact, emphasize the negative part of work. Accentuate the negative part, because the negative part of exercise, quite contrary to the claims of the promoters, the touters of isokinetic exercise, the negative part of exercise is by far the most important part of exercise.
My thanks to you, Arthur Jones, for being a guest on The Medicine Man. My thanks to everyone for watching the show. Any more information about any of the things we've discussed today, kindly write to us at P.O. Box 132, Moraga, California 94556. Good health.